There's no complete data that tells us which era had the most active global serial killers. If we look at the USA alone, though, in the 70s and 80s, they did seem to have a lot of maniacs killing multiple people. It was the 1970s when we first had serious criminal profiling as we know it today, as you might have seen in the show Mindhunter. Such profiling techniques were used to track down the likes of the notoriously brutal Ted Bundy. Psychological profiling was not just used to track down serial killers, but it is the modus operandi of killers that has made the most compelling tales. Are these profilers about to get very busy? That's what we'll find out today in this episode of the Infographic Show. Why this generation might have more serial killers than ever. Okay, so let's look more closely at the question of if the 70s and 80s really had more serial killers. The BBC asked this, and indeed the conclusion was yes, it is a fact. The Beeb interviewed a man who had been studying serial killers for many years. He said serial killing started becoming more common in the 1960s, and then got even worse in the 70s and peaked in the 80s. We might recall the names of some of the worst killers we've ever heard about in the aforementioned Ted Bundy, and add him to the likes of John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, William Bonin, the Freeway Killer, or over in the UK, the infamous Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. Why did all these killers emerge during these decades? Criminologist James Allen Fox told the BBC there were a few reasons. He said all violent crime, at least in the US, was on the rise during that era, mainly due to the fact that people were moving around a lot more. Folks often didn't know their neighbors, and of course vulnerable people often hitchhiked in those days. It just created an environment which was ideal for serial killers to prey on victims, said the criminologist. Add to that, the police didn't yet have large databases in which to track down killers, and the use of DNA didn't start until the 80s. That meant killers could commit way more crimes before they were caught. Another person interviewed on the matter said that there was more to it. You had public fascination with killers, and this may have inspired more of them. Then, in the book Sons of Cain, A History of Serial Killers, it's written that World War II had something to do with it. Some of the children of those soldiers lived with fathers that had experienced the worst kind of savagery that the world has ever seen, and that, according to the book, may have had a profound effect on how a few of those kids grew up. You had this trauma everywhere, and with it came the breakdown of some families. But the book adds something else. We might see a rise of serial killers again from this generation. Why is that? Well, it's complicated. In the book we just talked about, the writer says that recent times killers might create a generation that contains more serial killers than ever before. He writes that serial killers are monstrous, misshapen reflections in a distorted mirror to human civilization. They are kids that grew up watching terror alerts on TV, kids that grew up looking at X-rated videos that showed the aftermath of such terror, kids that are not even shocked by bloody content they can easily see on the internet. While people born in the 70s and 80s and 90s can see that too, they didn't have it on their doorstep, so to speak, all their lives. Such content has been normalized. The same author is interviewed by Psychology Today. In that interview, he talks about the rise of crime novels and pulp fiction in the 50s being some inspiration for serial killers. It might not have made them go out the door and start killing, but as Psychology Today writes, it probably created pubescent rehearsal fantasies. Now with crime fiction turning into real crime that can be seen anytime on the internet, the author believes, we may easily be facing another viral pandemic of serial killing. He believes this new wave will come when the new generation grow up to the age that most men start killing, usually late 20s or early 30s. Some kids of today might turn ugly in the early 2030s. Another crime expert said this in 2018, "We're raising a generation of killers because we're raising kids to kill since they are really little." What did he mean? In his book Inside the Mind of a Killer, he writes that kids are exposed to violence from childhood, on the internet, but also movies that involve some pretty insane torture scenes. He adds to that video games that have become so realistic you might believe in the actions you are doing. He says that if you take this fascination with virtually slaughtering people and add it to a broken home, with perhaps school bullying and the availability of guns, you might be looking at more kids going on wild killing rampages. He believes things such as school shootings are only going to get much worse. But is there any hard evidence that very violent video games actually make the players more violent or have violent fantasies? A 2014 study published in the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin did indeed say those playing violent games may become more aggressive because of it. But this is still a hot potato of a topic, and there's still no substantiated evidence that playing such games directly leads to extreme violence. We may know more later. Nonetheless, if you look hard enough, you can find some crimes which could have been said to have been partly inspired by games. You might look at the case of young killer Devin Moore, who is currently on death row in the US. His lawyer said the game Grand Theft Auto Vice City was partly responsible for the kid's shooting spree. Moore even once said, "Life is a video game, you've gotta die sometime." There are some other cases, but we may be skeptical regarding if the games really were such a big influence behind the crimes. But it's not just exposure to violence, as we've said, it's the era kids grow up in. If there is familial discord, there may be more kids with problems when they reach adulthood. We might look at children born to families that grew up with World War II and the Great Depression. Those kids, when older, were part of what's called the golden age of serial killers. Now we might look at families that grew up with conflicts in the Middle East and the financial collapse. If there have been difficulties and these kids have also been exposed to violence, well, we guess that's why some people might believe we might again see a rise in serial killers. Before you get too worried, of course, this forecast may not happen. In fact, if you look at the database created by Mike Amont, a professor at Radford University in Virginia, he says that there's no doubt been a reduction in serial killers and the number of victims serial killers get away with killing. He told The Guardian in 2018, "I'm careful to say there has been a decline in the number of serial killers we can identify. There could be thousands of serial killers that we don't know about and for some reason we're not identifying today as well as we did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He did add, though, that even if people wanted to kill serially, it would be much harder with improved law enforcement, omnipresent cameras, and the fact that people have changed their habits and don't usually head out into highways hitching cars without anyone knowing about it. This, of course, doesn't mean that there will be fewer people with the urge to kill, just that it will be harder to get away with it. Perhaps we'll see more mass shootings and fewer people going on to kill again and again." The author of the book we discussed told the New York Post that once these killers are caught, we might well hear them tell this kind of story. "We were living as a family in a home and come 2008 my dad committed suicide. My dad lost his job, he became a drug addict, he was an alcoholic, he was never the same. He lost his pride and I lost my dad." Do you think that's going too far? Have things really been that bad that we're going to see more killers in the future? Is exposure to violence on the internet and in games really such a big deal?